Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, in the name of the Swiss Institute of International Studies at Zurich University, I wish you all a very warm welcome. It has indeed become a tradition to discuss the current affairs and problems of today's world regularly here in the studio of Swiss Re's Center for Global Dialogue in Rüschlikon. At the same time, you can watch us by our live stream, wherever you are for the moment. In other words, welcome at home. And thank you to all our friends, Jacques and the whole crowd, who make this adventure possible. A very warm welcome, of course, also goes to our distinguished guest, Professor Michael Ignatieff. Dear Michael, we are more than honored to have you here and happy to share your insights. We cherish your competence for analyzing and tackling the many problems and challenges we currently face. Welcome. Indeed, it is more than true. We live referring to a Chinese saying in interesting times. Actually, in more than interesting times. The challenges are more than evident. The war in Ukraine and the Middle East, the role and policy of the new President of the United States, economic unpredictability, unrest by widespread Islamic terrorism, China's role in world politics and economics, the shaky shape of the European Union, the erratic condition of important states like Germany and France, and climate change, artificial intelligence, and on and on and on. Careful watches of what is happening today and what could happening tomorrow are indeed more than worried. We live in an age of disruptions, and the West is not fully aware yet how to cope with them. One thing is clear, however, I think it is more than time to leave the comfort zones and engage in responsibilities on all levels for our Western values, for the sake of democracy. Therefore, we are more than lucky to have Professor Michael Ignatieff with us tonight. A born Canadian, he studied at the universities of Toronto and Harvard and was also between 2006 and 2011 a politician for his country. Currently, Michael is Professor of History at the more than distinguished Central European University in Vienna, which he presided until 2021. The topic of tonight's discussion is democracy, a good to be defended. And I should add an exclamation mark, because the meaning of this title is, especially under today's circumstances, more than evident. We are also always happy that Dr. Katja Gentinetta, one of the Switzerland's leading political philosophers, is the moderator of tonight and later also of the discussion which will follow. Dear Michael, dear Katja, thank you again that you're here. We wish you good luck for a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martin, for this kind introduction, and let me welcome you from my side as well. You, Professor Ignatieff, dear Michael, good to have you here. You, the audience here, and the audience at home. As always, we will have a conversation first here, and then I will open to the audience here and at home, of course. A good to defend democracy. We had some conversations before about all your life, and I mean, Martin had told us where you come from. But when we look at your biography a bit closer, you were born in Canada, then you were studying in UK, you were working in UK, you came back to Canada as a member of the parliament, then you were faculty member of the University of Toronto and of Harvard Kennedy School. Then you went to Budapest for a Central European University, and still now you live in Vienna. This is a true cosmopolitan life you live. Sitting here today and talking about democracy to defend after what we live in these days, and especially last week with the election that we will briefly look at, don't you feel a bit like giving an elegy on democracy, stability, peace, and cosmopolitanism?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think cosmopolitanism accompanied globalization. I remember talking about a borderless world, and borders are going up everywhere. I used to have Chinese students in my classes, now I don't. And I worry that as the borders go up, as the frontiers reestablish themselves, we lose what globalization made possible. We learn from each other. We learn from each other's mistakes. We learned to balance something very important, that is different strokes for different folks, that is pluralism, differences of regime, differences of culture, differences of civilization, and at the same time, a few very common values that were genuinely universal. The crisis of globalization is now a crisis of the universal. I mean, if you're in the CICR, the ICRC, you're defending a universal value. Certain laws should apply in the conduct of war. The ICRC and the whole of Switzerland has stood by that value. It's not, that value is being pounded to pieces in places like Gaza, like places like Donetsk. And so it's not just frontiers going up, it's values crumbling. And I think that's where I think we all have a lot of anxiety at the moment.
Yes, and anxiety is not good, but maybe we're right to have it. I mean, we said, and we told to the public as well, we're not going to talk 1 hour about Trump and his and him winning the election. But nevertheless, he won, he's there now, and he will be able to govern with a clear majority in the Senate, of course, and very probably also in the House of the Representatives. That means that he can just govern through. He can just do what he wants to. And reminding a bit what he said in the last weeks, that he would like to be a dictator for one day. Do you think we will have the same democracy in 4 years on from now that we have in America? Or will it look really different?
I mean, who the hell knows, let's be honest. Trump has got a choice. He can either commit his administration to revenge, or he can commit his administration to building hegemony so that he would leave in 4 years, hand it over to J.D. Vance, and have 12 years of Republican ascendancy. If he chooses hegemony, he probably has to track a little bit more into the center, and he ought to be careful about dismantling about American institutions. If he's bent on revenge, he doesn't care about American institutions, and he will smash up all of China. So he's got a choice, and we don't know what choice he'll make. So that's one uncertainty. The one thing I would say, you know, I'm a liberal. I wouldn't have voted for Mr. Trump if I could have. But one of the things I didn't like that liberals were saying was that if you voted for Trump, you were voting basically to abolish democracy. I know what happened on January 6, 2021. It was an unforgivable betrayal of his office by the president, right? No question. But those who voted for him didn't vote to abolish democracy. They didn't vote for a king. They didn't vote for a monarch. They didn't vote to abolish American institutions. They voted for Trump because they thought he listened to them. Okay? That's the disturbing message for the liberal elite. He appeared to be listening to them better than Kamala Harris and the Democrats. So, and that's fact number one. And so that's in praise of democracy. Democracy is good to be defended because it's a system that forces leaders seeking power to listen. And he listened. He exploited their grievances. He did all kinds of things that politicians do, but he heard something that the other side didn't hear. So, and one of the things he heard, which I think is disturbing for Europe, but vital, which is that one way to read that result is that 52 or 53 or 54% of the population of the richest country in the world believe the economy is not working for them. They are not sharing the American dream. The American dream is receding. One thought. The second thought is their government is not working, is not on their side. Those two thoughts gave Trump his victory. The liberal, the other America for whom the American dream is still alive is college educated, in the professions, middle class, not uniformly white. It's now much more plural and open. But that America does not understand the America for whom the dream doesn't work. And Trump understands the America for whom the dream doesn't work better than the Democrats, and that's why he's the president. And so it was a democratic election that delivered a democratic result. And in my view, the other final thing, I'm sorry to go on, I'll be more concise later. One of the other good bits of news is that people did not vote by gender or race. Democrats are walking around being shocked that women voted for Trump, blacks voted for Trump, Latinos voted for Trump. What I would say to that is really good news. People are voting their convictions. They're not voting their identity. What's not to like about that? I don't like the result, but it's good for democracy. Right?
Yes, we will see. I mean, I follow you in everything you say. Looking now who is putting into office people like Elon Musk or a TV moderator for the Pentagon, we will see what this will give. But okay, let's make him, let's start him, and then let's see what's going to be. Of course, Trump as an American president is also a world leader. And we are now in the midst of a great power competition. And especially the US are reading this competition as a competition between autocracy and democracy. And I ask myself, where will Trump find himself? Where will he be? Will he will he be a leader of a democracy, or will he also flirt with autocracy and then not knowing where America is in this competition?
I'm going to look like an awful fool if he turns out to be a dictator, but I think that we should not underestimate the countervailing powers of American institutions, number one. And number two, as I said earlier, I don't think the Trump electorate voted for a dictator. They voted for solutions to their problems. So I wouldn't give up on democracy too early. The thing I would also add is if you take Trump seriously, he wants to make America great again. If you want to make America great again, one of the choices Trump has to make is whether he uses the alliance system that America built after 1945, which is, in my view, one of the key sources of American strength. China doesn't have alliances like America does. Russia doesn't have alliances, but America has a vast network of alliances, not just NATO, but Japan, South Korea, friends in Latin America. And these are a force multiplier. Trump is a transactional actor who thinks, what's in it for me? He doesn't like alliances because they constrain him. He's got to decide whether he understands that they also vastly multiply American power. So if he wants to make America great again, it seems to me he's got to make some key decisions about alliances, chiefly NATO, but also his alliances in Asia. Because I don't see how he can confront China, how he can confront Russia without that alliance structure. So these are the decisions that he has to make, and I don't think we know the answers. That's why I'm worried like everybody, but I think a man who wants to make America great ought to be smart enough to understand you don't set NATO on fire. You don't set South Korea on fire. You don't set Japan on fire. You keep this together because you want to reinforce American power, right? That would be rational. Then the question is whether he's rational.
Exactly, but let's not discuss that now. But I think this is, I mean, it's a good optimistic note to see that. And of course he has choices, and we'll see. I mean, there is a scenario that he will, of course, with his transactionalism, with his dealing, he will of course ask Europe to do more for its own security.
And what's so bad about that?
And that's not bad. That's the right thing to do. And I wonder what deals will he will get with the autocrats, with Putin, regarding Russia, regarding the Ukraine, with China. We will see that. I mean, let's hope that he's as rational as you described him now.
But again, if he's looking for a deal in Ukraine, he doesn't care about Ukraine. He has no feeling for this. What he has an intense feeling for is his own power. A deal that sells Ukraine to Putin is not good for Trump. It does not make America great. It makes America small and weak. So I don't, he's going to have to make decisions here. But if he sells out Ukraine, he diminishes American power and sends, crucially, a key message to China. He says to China, I'm not prepared to fight Russia, and I'm not going to fight you over Taiwan. The geostrategic linkage between Ukraine and Taiwan is very direct. The Chinese are watching the Americans closely to see how far they're prepared to defend Ukraine. They're not prepared to defend Ukraine, they won't defend Taiwan. So a president that wants to make America great has to understand these dimensions.
We will hope so. Let's shift a bit. I mean, you are a real liberal. You're a traditional liberal. You fought for liberalism the whole of your life, and you described liberalism very, very thoughtfully, shortly in a Václav Havel lecture, where you described the different achievements of liberalism, such as immigration reforms, feminism, civil rights, sexual revolution. And you said that liberalism has become a way of life. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is one thing, and we all love this way of life, but we also know, and we lived it these last years, that all these politics turned into identity politics and wokeism. That they really got radical. Mm. And the question for me is, and I really struggle with that, because what is identity politics and especially wokeism? You can go that far with these values, but is it inherent in this liberalism, or were there moments also in your life and in your career where you said, "Oh, this is now going too far. Whatever values I defended, this is now going too far"?
It's a great question, and I puzzle about it myself. Look, I'm a child of the 60s. I was 21 in 1968. Bliss was in that dawn to be alive, as Wordsworth would say, because we were looking at changes to immigration, which opened Canada and the United States to immigration from around the world. And believe me, whatever you think about immigration, it was wonderful for both countries. Civil rights had just emancipated the black population in the American South, and suddenly we had these fantastic American politicians coming into the political system. Feminism changed my life completely. My relationships to women were kind of turned completely upside down. The gay revolution was enormously important, so that in 2016, one of the most moving moments of my life was officiating at the marriage of one of my students to the man he loved, which 50 years before would have been impossible. Did it go too far? Yes, it did go too far, because one of the things that my side, the liberal side, didn't understand was that this set of social changes taken together completely overturned the existing social order. And it made a lot of people frightened, and a lot of people uncertain, and a lot of people resistant. And so the liberal response when we were in government was to enforce coercive speech codes and to point at someone and say, you're a racist if you had some difficulty about migration, or you're a sexist if you had some difficulty about women's advancement or gays' advancement. We created a kind of an enforcement regime, and we forgot what liberalism is all about. Our charter value is freedom, you know? And freedom is a chilly, disagreeable kind of thing. You know, I don't like your freedom, you don't like my freedom, but we are committed to defend each other's freedom. And I am not in a business of telling you what the hell to think. You know? If you're frightened of immigration, if you're worried about gay sexuality, if you're worried about feminism, I've got to listen to you. I can't say, here is what you have to think. And we were doing too much of, here is what you have to think. And so liberalism forgot its commitment to freedom and became just another form of what is called coercive political correctness. And Trump is in power in part because he picked up fury at this. Someone who is worried about immigration in Europe is not necessarily a racist. Some people are just straight racist anti-Semites, and they have to be fought and punished where they break the law. But somebody who has a concern about immigration, it's a legitimate political concern. And we need to have a democratic discussion. That's what democracy is for. But we were shutting down debate. We were suppressing debate as if there was nothing to discuss. And that was a pretty serious mistake.
I mean, the question is, what is happening now? Because we had these debates also in Europe. We have populist movements for some years now. I mean, the main shot now is really that Trump is re-elected. I think this is really sort of an end of wokeism at a certain level. And the question is, what is going to be there next? I mean, for example, these liberal elites in the American universities, are they? I mean, there is a lot of grievance now, but are they able to take this challenge and to read society as it is and to change a bit their handling of societies and their thinking about?
I spent 15 years at Harvard, and I saw the ways in which Harvard was increasingly taken over by a kind of narrow liberal frame in which
ideology.
Essentially an ideology. And I think that was bad for Harvard. It's certainly bad for my classroom. So, but what is equally bad was then this partisan political attack by Trump's people. Stefanik, who's going to be the ambassador to the United Nations, put all the Ivy League presidents through this kind of public pounding, which was at the limit an attack on the necessary academic freedom that all institutions have to have. My concern as a liberal is that I think we betrayed academic freedom by creating an ideological frame for our discussions. But let's not exaggerate that. I mean, I remember, my classroom at Harvard in 205, 206 was full of, wonderful American serving men who'd fought. They'd fought in Iraq, they'd fought in Afghanistan. They were Republican voters, often strongly Christian. they were in the classroom, and then I had very far left people in the classroom. So let's not rewrite the story. There was much more classroom diversity. That's what made teaching in that environment so thrilling. So I'm hoping that liberal universities will get back to the business of what we need to do, which is teaching people how to think for themselves. Yeah. That's the job. And we were not teaching how to think for themselves. We were teaching them what to think.
What to think and
Mistake.
what to think. Right? Yes. Truly. I mean, this is the liberal, looking at liberalism from on the national level. But if we defend democracy and liberal democracy on the international level, we even have another problem. I mean, we have a problem that today our values, and you talked about the universal values of freedom, democracy, and the right, and equality before on the right. And these universal values are now looked at and said to be Western and not universal anymore by the global or greater South or however we call it. So did the liberalism not only within the nations went too far, but also on the international level?
Yeah. Well, God, I thought I was coming to Swiss Re and this thing to have a nice, easy evening. You keep asking me all these.
We're not in nice, easy times.
Look, I've taught international human rights and international humanitarian law for 20 years. It's what I do. And I think there's a narrow range of universals. There are things, by which I mean something quite concrete. There are some things you must never, ever do to human beings, no matter what. In particular, there are no political justifications for doing certain things to human beings. Torture, arbitrary detention, to name just two. In the conduct of military operations, civilians must be protected. In other words, there are a number of universals, but they're small and they're quite precise. Beyond that, and I think I've revised my views about this, I don't think democracy is a universal value for every society. I don't think capitalism and free markets are a universal for every society. We can't run an international world without accepting different strokes for different folks, without accepting a basic pluralism in our understanding that China has 2,000 years of a political history, Russia has 1,000 years of a particular political history. Expecting them to become liberal democracies anytime soon is just a total waste of time. What we need to do is focus on the narrow range of things that both they and we agree we must never do to human beings. The thing that is a shock at the moment, a real shock, particularly in relation to Ukraine, Russia was one of the builders of the post-45 world. The post-45 world wasn't just built by the United States. Russia was a contributing creator of the universal human rights regimes, in particular, one key rule, which is the non-intervention rule and the sovereignty rule. And the flagrant violation of the territorial integrity of sovereignty of Ukraine by a P5 member of the Security Council has blown the international system apart, to which the Russians will then immediately say, well, what about Iraq? And they're not wrong about that. Both of the great powers have broken up the order of universals, limited number of universals, that created the order we've had. And this is why we're in as it were, a post-liberal, post-universal world. Both sides are responsible, and and so we're fighting an uphill battle to defend minimal basic human rights for everybody, a minimal list of things we never do to other human beings. But if we had that, we'd have civilization. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, we have a lot of barbarism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I find it especially interesting as you were working for this famous responsibility to protect resolution at the UN, which was adopted in 2005 to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and so on. And exactly that R2P, that responsibility to protect, was criticized because it also failed. And if I understand you right, you would not be anymore so convinced that this was a good thing to do. And the question is now, describing what, as you described Russia now in its behavior and China, of course they say their most important thing within UN is their sovereignty, to say, this is our inner thing, you don't interfere in our inner politics. The question is, I mean, let's take these from two extremes. What will the UN survive this attack, or has there to be another international order? Or
well, I think the UN will survive because its secondary agencies are out there in the world keeping people from starving and dying, and so those agencies will continue. But the center of the UN, the Security Council, I think is deadlocked as far ahead as we can see. And we need to remember that it was deadlocked for 50 years of the Cold War, so let's not set our hair on fire. But there's no doubt the international order is in worse shape than it has ever been. The Cold War did produce a certain kind of very carefully calibrated order between the belligerents, which we've now lost. I mean, I don't want to alarm people, but you've all seen it on your cell phones. You know, Russian planes in international airspace coming within 10 feet of American surveillance aircraft. You've seen the Chinese patrol boats, colliding with Philippine boats in international waters. We are this close to the kind of accident that could escalate out of control. And I don't mean to be alarmist, but we need to know where we are. And when you learn, as we did, months ago, that the Chinese and the Americans didn't even have a deconflicting hotline, a basic thing to avoid accidents. They didn't even have a phone between Beijing and Washington to stop a deconfliction in the case of an accident. You think we're really much closer to the abyss than we sometimes think. So I say that to make us frightened, but if that's the case, I do think all the parties concerned, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans, have a strong interest to walk back to deconfliction regimes, negotiation on the quiet, management of this to prevent a nuclear exchange, essentially. And so I'm not pessimistic that we've come very close, but I can see strong reasons of state why we'll pull back. I hope so. Mm-hmm.
Again, a bit optimistic. That's good. It's good to hear that. I mean, when we see now, when we have to save democracy, and especially liberal democracy, you lived in Budapest for many years. You became president of the Central European University in 2016, and we all know that Viktor Orban pulled this university out of his country by conflicts also with George Soros, who funded this university. But Viktor Orban was one of the first on the European continent to deliberately promote an illiberal democracy. Yes. Yes. Did you send that directly when you were in Budapest? Did you feel that? Did you see yes. what the turnover was?
No.
And were you able to do something about it? I mean, I already asked you. Did you call Orban to say, please not?
No, I sent people to talk to Orban. I sent people who, I had professors at my university who'd been his professors. I sent the professors up the hill to talk to them, and they talked to Orban for hours. It's a small society where everybody knows each other, so I thought it was much more interesting for him to listen to an old professor than to listen to me. Look, Orban said something a couple of years ago, which I think is the key to understanding Orban. He said of the Western Europeans, we used to think you were our future. Now we know that we are your future. That's a chilling thought. The thing about Orban is that it's a small country, but he has managed to leverage enormous influence in the international system, partly by playing the Brussels game like a virtuoso, and partly also by an ideological attack on Western liberalism. He came after us as the beginning shot of what is in fact a Weltanschauung. You know, I mean, it's a vision that Western liberalism is weak, corrupt, cosmopolitan in the worst sense of the word, permissive, everything goes, no standards, no values, destructive of the family, weak, hypocritical. It's a complete rejection of Western liberalism in the name of nationalism, family, order, stability, etc.
Christianity.
Sorry?
Christianity.
Yeah.
So very conservative values against these modern values. So.
Yes, and he thinks the future, history is with him. So it's a big vision of the world coming from a very small country, and he's parlayed this ideological effect into a position of really immense influence with Wilders in the Netherlands, with some of the people, with the people in peace in Poland, with Slovakia. I could go on. The number of people who've signed up to his fan club is very large, and he has crucial support in the United States. The reason we were unable to beat him in Hungary is that he got into the Trump White House. And basically, we're an American university accredited in the United States, and we, for 30 years, had counted on the support of the American government to just have a quiet word if we got into a problem. And the quiet word was, get him out. And that's why we're now in Vienna. So the geopolitics of this was what really led to our defeat. He just didn't want to have a liberal American accredited social science institution in Budapest. So you can't, if that's what the boss says, you can't fight that indefinitely. But it's worth remembering that, lest you think that all Hungarians go along with him, that we had the largest demonstration since 1989 in our defense in the streets of Budapest. 80,000 people walked past my office at the university one Sunday afternoon chanting, "Free universities in a free society." They got it immediately, that there's a connection between free institutions and their freedom. And that's, I think, the thing that universities everywhere need to do, to reconnect the academic freedom that universities enjoy with the democratic freedom of ordinary citizens. Because at the moment, I think people think of academic freedom as the kind of privilege of a bunch of spoiled professors, and God knows we're spoiled. But our freedom is essential to a free society simply because we're the only people out there whose profession is to validate knowledge. And in a world of fake news and illusion and propaganda, the university's role in saying, this looks true to us, is more and more important to basically equilibrating democracy itself.
But if you put that now into a landscape, we have this situation in the US, we have the landscape in Europe, where we have these several populists, and we see it all over in Germany, in France, where the election, where the partisans at the extremes, they are winning. how can democracy be saved then? I mean, if I look at you, you were a politician, you were an author, you were an academic, and you're still an academic, you teach, you talk. What is the most impactful media instrument to save democracy? I mean, what should we do?
Well, I was asked that in Hungary before I got into my conflict with Orban. A bunch of people said, what do we have to do to get Orban out? I said, what you have to do is get on the road on a rainy Thursday night and show up in a small hotel in a little provincial town where there will be 4 people coming to your meeting, and you have to do that night after night for about 5 years. That's how you defend democracy. That's how you win. And at the moment, interestingly, there is a politician in Hungary doing exactly that. He's a renegade from Fidesz, so he's center-right. He's a nationalist, he's a Christian Catholic, all good things. But he has gone to small towns on rainy Thursday nights for about a year, and his party is now running neck and neck with Orban. So this isn't rocket science, folks. There's no fatality that says that liberal democracy is going to perish. Liberal democracy perishes if people won't get out there and do the hard, bloody slog of being a democratic politician. I've done that. I wasn't the world's greatest success at it, but I know that's what makes democracy tick. People put their names on a ballot and work their guts out and try and serve the people. End of story.
So it's just hard work.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
really basically hard work.
Oh, well, hard work and listening, picking up the mood music of a frightened, disoriented, disturbed public who doesn't know and wants leadership, wants to know there's someone who is listening to them, cares about what they care about, and wants to do whatever they can to make their lives a little better. I know I'm sounding a little sentimental, but having put my name on a ballot 3 times, I'm very sentimental indeed about democracy and passionately devoted to it and impatient with anybody who says democracy's done. I just think democracy has this incredible capacity to renew and revive itself, and I would go so far as to say the Trump election on November 5th was actually good for democracy. As much as I dislike the result, it was good for democracy.
But in the sense of a wake-up call, I mean, you mean that?
Absolutely. It woke the whole world up.
But I think that this is really an interesting thing because, I mean, we have literature about reforming democracy, and you wrote about that as well, citizen assemblies, federalism, ethic commissions, proportional representation instead of majority votes. That's all fine, but I think we're not at that point. We're now at the point where we really have to come back and to do these basic works. And if I look at the grand landscape, at the big landscape, it's not only democracy, it's also defense. I mean, who is ready to really fight for freedom? Not many.
Yeah. Well, I hope we don't have to fight, but I do think we want to stand for freedom. I mean, I see 2 problems in Europe, one of them, but both of them illuminated by the Trump victory. The Trump victory tells you that 55% of the American public does not share the prosperity and the benefits of the most powerful economy in the world. If that's true in the States, it must be true in Europe, possibly more so. East Germany doesn't feel its shares. Parts of Holland don't feel its share. Slovakia, we can go around the board and you can see the same simmering feeling that the system doesn't work for me. And that means that's something that Europe has to fix. And it can only be fixed by good, honest politics. But the second challenge for Europe is Europe's going to have to defend itself. It built the entire post-war infrastructure of the welfare state on being able to reduce its defense expenditure down to 1% of its GDP. That story is over. A Europe that, you use the word defend itself, I mean it literally. If you want to have a Europe that's free, you're going to have to spend 2-3%, and you're going to have to persuade a very reluctant European public that problems that seem very far away, like Ukraine, like the territorial integrity of the Baltic states, like the territorial integrity of Poland, are going to require defense expenditure up above 2%, possibly up 2.5, and that's a hell of a bite. And so politicians are going to be facing some very, very serious challenges at a time when public infrastructure is frayed and
exactly,
etc.
Exactly. I mean, I always ask myself, are we now really at a new point in history? Because democracy now was working for the last 60, 70 years. We had more or less constant growth. We were constantly able to put more money into the welfare state, infrastructure were well, we could build up education, whatever you want. So politicians were always able to put money into every problem and solve it by that. And maybe we're now the first time, democracy is the first time at a point where it has to decide on trade-offs.
Indeed, indeed.
Is democracy capable to do that?
Well, one of the weaknesses of liberals, I'm a liberal, so I'm a social welfare liberal. Center left, center right, I straddle the things. But my focus has always been on distributional equity. We can't distribute anymore unless we start solving the productivity problem. Europe is sitting there watching the technologies of the 20th century monopolized in about 4 big super companies in the United States and in China. And I just don't see a way in which Europe sustains its social model if politics is captured by politicians who are thinking only about distribution and not about production. We've simply got to get these economies to work. And Germany, just north of you, is really struggling. It's got itself locked into the diesel engine and it can't get out. It has some fantastic companies, fantastically innovative people, but we don't have the capital markets. I mean, this is getting a bit in the weeds, but the most staggering single fact about a place like Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I spent 15 years, is not simply that it had Harvard and MIT a mile apart. It had incredible capital markets, specialized capital markets that could take a good PhD out of MIT or Harvard and commercialize it in 5 years with capital streams. We don't have capital markets that are marrying innovation and money in the way that we need. And Draghi and all these guys are pointing this out. But a liberal like me has got to learn that we won't have the Europe that we've had since 1945 unless we get capital markets solved, unless we get European-wide capital markets at scale, unless we get the transmission line between university knowledge and commercialization right, and we haven't. All this stuff remains to be done. And, I have children, and I worry greatly that they will have the incredibly happy life I had because I was born in a period of productive growth and distribution. I worry about the future we're going to give to them unless we solve these production problems.
Interesting. I didn't expect us coming to innovation, but listening to you, that means that really the European Union should do something. That means that the member state of the European Union should be pushing this on the international, on the European level, which is not obvious that they will do that.
No question. I mean, because you can't, this is a case where beggar my neighbor industrial policy means nobody's industrial policy works. This is where this is what Draghi is saying. You've got to get big aggregations of capital channeled to a couple of places where they can make a step change in innovation and development. But I'm doing something that no historian should do, and especially not in this audience. I'm straying into an area where I'm not an expert. I just feel it politically as being essential.
And I wanted to make the handover to the next and final point in our discussion. You express hope at several times in your essays and lectures. But listening to you today, you're more optimistic than I thought, or that one might be in these times. But you're still, hope is still something important, according to you.
I don't think you can have a politics that isn't based on hope, and I don't think you can have a life that isn't based on hope. But, you know, let's look at the challenge. The challenge is we've got a disintegrating international order. I'm the one who said, you know, the planes are coming within 10 feet of collision, so we are not just a disintegrating international order, but an order that could simply explode at any moment. That's problem one. We have a real problem with climate change. You can't look at the sight of these cars piled up in the streets of Valencia and the mud and the sense of climate change now here, putting up premiums for everybody in the insurance industry. So, and then third, the productivity challenge I mentioned. Fourth, the tremendous strains that democracy is facing. I am more optimistic about the strains facing democracy because I think we've got to be clear in our mind that the fact that we have right-wing parties and we have parties who are saying things we hate isn't a sign that democracy is in crisis. It is actually a sign that democracy is doing what it should do, which is expressing opinion and feeling that any political system has to acknowledge. If you don't, the whole thing explodes. So I feel less pessimistic about democracy. You're picking that up. But I think I don't want to go and sit with my children and tell them to be hopeful.
What would you recommend them to do?
What I actually want to tell them is to be courageous, which is quite different. I think we need courage more than hope, because there's a kind of empty hope talk, a kind of empty optimism, which isn't any damn good. We're in a deep hole here. The times are very serious, and not particularly because of Trump. We're inheriting the slow collapse of the world that I grew up in. That's what's happening. And we don't quite know what will come after. So we need courage, which means actually two things. It means faith in our children, that is, faith that they're no smarter, no less smart than we are, and so we need to back up our kids. And I think we also can derive courage from the memory of our parents. If I can get a little sentimental for a moment. You know, my mother was going to marry a man who died at Buchenwald. She came back from the Second World War, and she rebuilt her life and, you know, was a wonderful mother. I think of all those women, you know, the rubble women in Berlin, you know, rebuilding their lives after having been raped by Soviet troops, survived the bombings of Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, rebuilt the Wirtschaftswunder. I think of those women. I think they didn't have hope in 1945, but God Almighty, they had courage. So you want to remember, if we have a strong historical connection to good examples of courage in the past, and we bet on the courage of our children, I think we'll be just fine, actually. But it's not about hope, because I couldn't give you a happy story here of a rebuilt international order, a Europe that is back on its feet productively and at peace with itself, an America that has solved its 50-year institutional crisis. I think anybody who sells you those goods ought to be, dismissed.
So being courageous, that's good. What would you concretely recommend the younger generation? Now, especially those that saw their future in a US elite, in a US Harvard elite, for example?
What I do in my classroom and have done for 25 years of my life and love doing it is I say, history matters. History really matters. Knowing where we've come, why we are in the situation we are matters. Knowledge. Being able to tell the difference between a belief, an opinion, and a fact. Getting the epistemology of democracy right. We're swimming around in this kind of soup of cheap opinions and cheap rumor and this. It's ever more important for university teachers like me to sit there with kids and say, this is a belief, but it is not backed up with a fact. Why do you think that? You have no good reason to think that. And my job is to be tough with these kids. And I think we all need to be tough with each other about this, because democracy depends on an epistemology, which we never really talk about, which is some things are true and some things are false. In the insurance business, some things are true and some things are false. Some calculations of risk pan out and some aren't. And if you lose that basic sense of knowledge, we're done for. And so that's the thing I can do, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Last question. I mean, you as a historian, you overview many eras and many changings and many revolutions and whatever. Do you have an estimate of where we are now in this change? I mean, are we at the beginning of a transition? Are we in the midst? Is it the job for the next generation to put things right again in our classical liberal sense?
I think, it's like, it's that wonderful phrase in Dante, we're in the middle of a dark wood. We're in the middle. That's what makes it agonizing. We can't see the light of the road ahead, and we may have to go through certain circles of darkness. I feel that the Trump earthquake was long in preparation. That's why I say we're in the middle. Mm-hmm. This didn't just start this year. We've had 25 basically terrible years, from 9/11 through the financial crisis, through the migration crisis, through COVID. Boom, boom, boom. One blow after another, which has destabilized and fragilized political systems everywhere. And we desperately need some calm water. But I don't see calm water ahead, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. But we're looking out for it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
We will now take some questions from the audience here and from the audience at home. Who wants to start? Yes, please. Patrick Frost.
Thanks. So you're based in Austria, and you mentioned some family anecdotes. What's your take on how to deal with the far right in the German-speaking countries?
Yeah.
Is it different than in the rest of Europe? Do you think the established political parties are right to isolate the far right? Mm. Or do you think they should deal with them or take them into government or not?
That's a great question, a difficult one, and I think there's a German flavor to these questions, a German context to these questions. I felt, in relation to Austria and Mr. Kickl got 29.5% of the vote in the last election, but President van der Bellen, a man I very much admire, decided not to ask Mr. Kickl to form a government. He went instead to other political parties. And he did so because he felt Mr. Kickl was not, convenable, and he was not, ready for prime time. But I think he made a mistake. I think the right thing to do with a right-wing party that comes that close to power is you ask them to form a government. Because if you don't ask them to form a government, you appear to be saying to the 29.5% of the Austrian public who voted for him and want him to form a government, we don't care what you think, right? So the right thing to do is to get him to try and form a government. He doesn't have a majority in the parliament, so he has to find one with a coalition. Let him try and find a coalition. If he can find a coalition, then he governs. In other words, my view of the far right is that my side of the argument, liberal, social democratic, center left, has confused two questions. We hate what Mr. Kickl and people like him are saying, but what they're saying is not necessarily a threat to democracy or the democratic order. It's just nonsense, but it's not the line that we have to hold to is the constitutional order. If Kickl is prepared to play by the Constitution, fine. And then you trust that democracy, when Mr. Kickl exercises power, and Mr. Kickl previously exercised power and didn't do so well. So democracy then clears the table and gets rid of Mr. Kickl because Mr. Kickl wasn't able to do the things that he said he would do. The same thing with Mr. Wilders in the Netherlands. I don't like what Mr. Wilders says about immigration for two reasons, because I think what he wants is impossible, and because what he believes is wrong. But if Mr. Wilders plays by the Dutch Constitution and abides by the rules of the Dutch Constitution, better in the tent than out is my basic instinct on all these questions, even with AfD in Germany. The absolutely impermissible line, and there you must act swiftly and decisively, is any use of political violence. If you have an AfD candidate who is part of an attempt to set fire to an immigrant hostel, boom, that guy gets prosecuted, he gets debarred from parliament, you throw the book at him. You throw the book at a party that has any association with violence or intimidation. But any party that plays by the constitutional rules, i.e., if they lose, they leave office, right? If they win, they take office. That's, I think, how you deal with it. And I think there's been a confusion, I said about Trump, that people say, oh, he's a threat to democracy. He's only a threat to democracy if he refuses to follow the rules of the constitutional order of the United States. And he was a threat once because he appeared to refuse to step down and then spread a vicious and false rumor that he had won the election. That's why he's dangerous, not because of his views, but he has every right to run, and provided he does not use intimidation or violence, democracy has to deal with these kind of challenges.
Strong plaidoyer for institutions. We have another question back there.
Thank you very much for this interesting conversation. Entschuldigung. I would argue that we are in a similar situation as in the late 1960s and in the 70s. I would even argue that in the United States it was even worse at that time than it is today. I mean, you had Vietnam War, assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy.
Yeah.
You had a president who had to step down. Geopolitical instability, Iranian revolution, Afghanistan. I mean,
Yes.
I could go on. And, well, it was quite easy to turn around the situation in the 1980s. It didn't take that long to normalize at least some of the problems. So that gives me a lot of confidence that, you know, it's just cyclical. And we're going through another difficult time, but it's not the first time. We don't have to go back to the World War as you did with your mother to be sure that, you know, we have the capacity to go forward. What do you think about this argument?
Yeah. Well, that in a way is music to my ears because I was alive during that time and lived through, I mean, I vividly remember Martin Luther King's assassination followed right afterwards by Bobby Kennedy's death in assassination in California. In the same year that Lyndon Johnson decided not to run again, and you talk about institutional instability and crisis and chaos. And you could also add the very substantial riots in Los Angeles and other major American cities at that time. So yes, America has been through periods of deep institutional crisis that were then followed, as I think you're implying, by the Reagan years and the Clinton years when you had a period of stability. What worries me, however, is that some of the problems we've got in 2024 are the consequence of bad decisions made in the 60s and 70s. My sense is the crisis has been accumulating for a very long time. So you can take the story in two ways. The thing that is, I think, alarming to me, and here I become a Canadian momentarily, is the money in American politics and the effect that the money in American politics has in people's perception of the legitimacy of American politics. Say what you will about a little country like Canada, but I'm rather proud of the fact that every single dime that I received in my political campaign over 5 years is recorded on a public website with the address of every single person who gave me the money. And that's the right way to run a political system, because it meant that I could appear in public without anybody implying that I'd been bought. Very few American politicians can stand up without someone accusing them of being bought. So big money is a problem in politics, and it's got steadily worse over the last 50 years. That would be an example of this kind of accumulating crisis that is, I think, affecting the legitimacy of American democracy.
I have two questions that I would take from here. Take them together. Have we wrongfully taken democracy not only as granted, but also the model sought after by the ones who were not there yet? So, did we wrongfully think that democracy is there for everyone? And then another question, has democracy and the value attributed to it to do with age and generation?
Oh, yeah. The second.
So it's only us,
Well,
the old ones, who think that democracy is the only right thing in the world.
One of my worst moments in Canadian politics was discovering that only 1 in 5 Canadian citizens under the age of 25 bothered to vote in one of the federal elections where I was, whereas the participation rates of my generation and behind, I'm very old, was in the 40s and 50s and 60s. You won't have a democracy if the kids don't vote. And so the second part, I actually have quite a lot of concern Although, interestingly, Trump did very well with a youth vote in the United States. The exit polls indicate that young people did vote for him, and so why not? And the first question was...
have we wrongfully taken democracy not only as granted, but also as the model sought after by the ones who were not there yet?
Yeah.
So, everyone, it's a bit the Fukuyama thesis on...
Yeah.
I
do think as a historian that it sure helps if you have a democratic tradition, you have a tradition of the rule of law, and it's really very difficult to get democracy to stick if you don't. I mean, one of the reasons that Orban is in power after 14 years is that Hungary's political tradition prior to him is just awful. János Kádár, goulash communism, then Admiral Horthy, who was presided helplessly over the extermination of 400,000 of his Jewish citizens. So he capitalizes on a tradition of authoritarianism that a lot of Hungarians think that's how we've always been governed. But you have to be careful about this, because I can remember all kinds of discussions that after African states became independent, people said, well, not really ready for a democracy. These are tribal peoples. They never, and then you look at Ghana, some pretty good elections. You look at other countries in Africa, pretty good elections. So I'm enough of a universalist to believe that given a chance, given the right institutional conditions, every population wants to have some say in how they're governed, right? Some say. But there are some places where the conditions for democratic freedom are they just aren't there.
At least.
And so, we have to live with a China that has never really had an extended or any period of democratic freedom, but it has a political tradition that goes back centuries, and that has to be respected and understood. And there isn't any reason why we can't have perfectly decent geostrategic relations with people who have very different political systems. And I think that's what liberal pluralism commits us to. It doesn't mean at the same time that we don't say to the Chinese, look, it's going to be very difficult for us to buy Chinese goods made with slave labor in Xinjiang. I mean, I'm sorry. We understand your system is different, fine, but don't ask us to be complicit in your systematic violation of the human rights that we just think are basic. We have no reason not to say that. But the idea that we can only deal with China, we must confront China because it's not democratic, I don't think is right. We confront China because it could be a danger to international peace and security if it invades Taiwan. That's a different matter. It's not about we oppose the regime as a regime type. We oppose it because it poses a threat to international peace and security. That's the issue.
And the question is always, are we consequent enough in the buying things? We had another question there, even two, so these two, or take you together.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this very interesting discussion. I have a specific question regarding democracy. There are different forms, especially in Switzerland, we have this direct democracy. In most other countries, you have this parliamentary democracy. So no referendums or very seldom referendums. Wouldn't that be an opportunity to strengthen democracy elsewhere by going a little bit in the Swiss direction? What is your view on that?
I've never really understood. You guys are crazy, Swiss people. But it works. It works. I think one of the good things about democracy following this is that it takes very different forms in different places. Canadian democracy, we are, right on the American border, and our political culture is 100% different. We just run a different democratic system. My previous example about money is an example of that. We have a lot of problems. Our democracy is not perfect, but it is suited to the history and tradition of our country. We have a highly decentralized political system, in part because we have a French minority. We're 25% of the population, and we're colonized by France and don't have our traditions of parliamentary democracy, but have adopted them enthusiastically. So that's an example. There are different democratic forms, and our very attachment to democracy is because it's specifically national. The Swiss are attached to their democracy because it's theirs. I'm attached to my democracy because it's mine. It's not some universal abstract norm. It's specific to the history and traditions of our country. And I think we want to say that. And democracy promotion overseas is often assumed there's this thing called democracy, which you just put in a can and you pour it out, and it's the same everywhere. So democracy promotion, if we're going to do it, has to be extremely sensitive to the national, tribal, cultural, linguistic traditions of each society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have 2 questions in the room, and will take 2 together from there. So the micro's over there. But
could you talk a little bit about the implications of technology on democracy, particularly social media?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you a story about that. I was in politics for 5.5 years, and as some of you know, it didn't go so well for me. But in 5.5 years, I think I shook 30,000 hands. It's not unusual for a politician. That's all you do all day. You shake hands all day. You're talking to people all day long. In the 5.5 years, there were 4 occasions in which my interpersonal interaction with someone was unpleasant. Somebody said, "I hate you, I dislike you, I don't agree with you, you're full of whatever," abusive. So that taught me something very interesting about politics. Face-to-face politics, real politics, subscribes to basic canons of civility that make democracy a wonderful thing. That is, we don't always say what we think, thank God. We're polite to each other even when we disagree. And those canons of behavior operated perfectly. They didn't vote for me, but they understood I was doing a difficult job. I was like a garbage collector or something. Somebody has to do it, right? Now, I'm getting to answer your question. The social media side, my wife said to me, "You are not going to read your social media feed for the next 5 years, because if you did, you wouldn't get out of bed." What does that tell you? The thing about social media that is frightening is that digital anonymity encourages disinhibition. And so the standards of civility that occur when you're in physical proximity to another human being disappear on the internet. The abuse that you get on the internet is absolutely extraordinary because there are no consequences for the person who abuses you. And, Sigrid Kaag, the very talented Dutch politician, female, got out of politics because she thought, I can't take the level of threat. I can't take the level of abuse. My children are miserable because they look at the media. So my basic view is that social media has had an extremely pernicious effect in changing the standards of civility and interchange between elected people and their and their fellow citizens. And I think it's been responsible for the coarsening of political dialogue, no question about it.
I would just get one last question from here. It's a bit with social media behavior, but also with knowledge, as you said at the end, that young people need knowledge. And one guest is asking, knowledge matters, but what if knowledge just isn't reaching everyone?
Sorry?
What if knowledge isn't just reaching everyone?
Uh-huh. But that's what's, in a sense, such a tragic missed opportunity about social media. I mean, every one of us here carries the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria in our pockets. It's the most staggering thing in the world. Were you to say something to me and make a reference to some obscure Swiss politician I'd never heard of, I would quickly think, and I would get a whole biography within a second. This is an unprecedented development. And what's tragic is that we've replaced the Library of Alexandria with Bedlam. And I don't quite know how we get back to it. I just don't have a solution. The technology offers us knowledge for everyone. And there are some heroic examples of fantastic use of the internet. I mean, I use Wikipedia all day long, and I use the Internet Archive all day long. There are other wonderful resources, but it's a sewer as well, as we all know. And I don't quite know how we balance the freedom we need for the media with the regulation that we seem to be incapable of providing.
It's one of the $1 million questions. So a last question here from the room.
Professor Ignatieff, I very much enjoyed your exploration about your liberal view on democracy. But I think, don't you think that democracy is a branding, is a label of our Western, strongly connected to our Western society? It's not shared globally necessarily. I share the view of my predecessor who said that yes, we were already once in a rabbit hole in the 60s, 70s. I remember myself those days. But I've never encountered in my whole life so much distrust in democratic institution and loss of confidence in our politicians, in our political system, in our media, and even in our financial institution, which of course scares normal people everywhere, and does not really surprise me that the election in the United States ended up like the result we saw now. I still think, are we reaching the limits of our democratic system? Because if you're looking back a few thousand years, I mean, there were so many ways of tribes and people around the globe who lived quite peacefully without having implemented a democratic system.
Well, that's a great question to end the evening on.
I mean, we will not have another hour.
No, I'll try and be.
Is this the end of democracy, what we are actually
Yeah. I guess I don't agree, because my confidence in democracy is its extraordinary capacity to evolve, change, and respond to these ebbs and flows in confidence, in understanding. Democracy's capacity for self-correction, course correction. I don't like the result of the Trump victory, but I have a feeling it's a verdict on 25 to 30 years of failure by many American elites. You talk about the collapse of trust. Some of this is deserved. I mean, just look at the American context. 9/11, you have an entire security apparatus that failed to see the manifest likelihood of an attack on the continental United States. All the signs were blinking red, and the attack was not stopped in time. A massive failure of the biggest intelligence system in the world. Flash forward to 2008, you had in 2006 and 2007, many of you would have been familiar with this, signs of a dramatic and frightening overheating of the financial economy, a kind of casino capitalism that badly needed regulation, was not being regulated, and we came within an ace of a second Great Depression, but it devastated the thing of many people. We then moved forward to 2015 when Angela Merkel made judgments about immigration, but also moving back, judgments about nuclear power that in retrospect were the wrong decisions. You move forward to COVID, and we had a global public health system that didn't respond quickly and in time, and we were saved simply because we have fantastic scientists who came up with RNA vaccines quick enough, and we got them out and saved the world. But you can tell this a story is a failure of many of our institutions, our financial institutions, our government institutions, our intelligence institutions, right? And so people look at that and they think, we pay taxes for you guys to protect us. Where the hell were you? So I don't see this as a failure of democracy. I see the Trump victory as a verdict on the failure of those who were in power. And I didn't add Iraq. Iraq was a disaster for the United States. You put all this together, you've got 25 years of institutional failure. Not democratic failure, institutional failure, failure of elites. And, it's sobering, and it's difficult to absorb the weight of this. I taught at one of the greatest universities in the world, absolutely chock-a-block. My colleagues, many of whom I respect and admire, just giving bad advice. This is not very good, And I made some mistakes myself, which I'm not going to share with you, So, we all got to come awake and assume our own responsibilities. I won't talk about what responsibilities the global insurance industry have, because I don't know, but that's for you to think about. It's simple. We've all got to do a better job.
That's a good closing sentence. We will take that with us. Thank you very much, Michael Ignatieff, for being with us.
Thank you.